he was considered aggressive and hopeless, a dog waiting on death row that no one could reach. But when a lonely librarian named Clara began to read to him, her quiet voice broke through his wall of fear where all other methods had failed. They formed a deep, unspoken friendship, two quiet souls who had finally found their peace. But their story was far from over. Soon, they would have to confront a century-old mystery that held their entire town in its grip, a chilling legend that had baffled everyone for generations. What the town didn't know was that the key to solving its darkest secret wasn't a detective or an expert. It was the very dog everyone had thrown away. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the beginning. The moment Clara stepped through the doors of the county animal shelter, a wave of noise hit her like a physical force. The air was thick with a chorus of barks, whines, and the echoing clang of metal gates. Her shoulders instinctively tightened, a familiar tension creeping up her neck. In the quiet, ordered world of her library, every sound had a purpose and a place. Here, the chaos was overwhelming, a painful symphony of loneliness and fear that grated on her senses and made her wish she could cover her ears and retreat back into the silence she called home. The shelter manager, a man with tired lines around his eyes, led her down a concrete corridor. He pointed a thumb towards a cage at the far end, his voice weary. "That's him. Cage 7. He's a tough case," the man sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Been returned twice. Scares everyone. We've tried, but honestly, I don't think he's got much time left." The words were not cruel, just heavy with the reality of a place with too many animals and not enough hope. The warning was clear. Do not get attached to this one. Clara approached slowly and saw the dog. He was huge, a shaggy mix of brown and gray, and he threw himself against the chain-link door with a ferocious bark the moment he saw her. But as she stood her ground, her gaze went past the bared teeth and the angry noise. She focused on his eyes. They were wide and frantic, darting around as if searching for an escape from a threat only he could see. There was no malice in that gaze, no aggression. There was only pure, undiluted panic. Back in the small office, the manager handed her Barney's file. The pages were thin, but the words printed on them were heavy. "Aggressive tendencies," one note read. "Resistant to handling," said another. The final entry, written in stark black ink, felt like a final judgment. Unadoptable. Clara stared at the word, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The world had already given up on him, writing his story before it was truly over. It felt deeply, terribly unfair. As they stood there, a volunteer in the next aisle accidentally dropped a stack of metal food bowls. The deafening clang of steel on concrete echoed through the hall like a gunshot. From cage 7, Barney's furious barking instantly broke, replaced by a single, high-pitched yelp of terror. He scrambled to the back of his small enclosure, pressing himself into the corner and trembling, making himself as small as his large body would allow. It was a sound of pure fear, not a sound of anger. In that single moment, everything clicked into place for Clara. It was so simple, so obvious. He wasn't lashing out at people. He was lashing out at the noise. The clanging gates, the echoing barks, the dropped bowls. This entire place was a constant assault on his senses. It was never anger that drove him to the front of the cage. It was terror. The shelter, meant to be a place of safety, was his own personal nightmare. Clara handed the file back to the manager, her expression calm but determined. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She turned and walked out, the chaotic sounds of the shelter fading behind her. She didn't yet have a plan, only a deep, unshakable conviction. The world had misread this dog completely, and she wondered if a quiet voice could be enough to correct such a loud and terrible mistake. The next day, Clara returned to the shelter, carrying a small canvas bag. The staff gave her curious, skeptical glances as she walked past them, not with a leash or treat, but with a well-worn children's book in her hand. She didn't stop at the office. She walked directly down the concrete corridor, her footsteps soft and deliberate, until she stood before cage 7. Barney was already there, watching her approach with a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Instead of trying to open the gate or speak to him, Clara simply sat down on the cold concrete floor, a safe distance away. She crossed her legs, placed the book in her lap, and took a slow, calming breath. She didn't look him directly in the eye, knowing it could be seen as a challenge. Barney watched her every move, his body tense with suspicion, the growl a constant, vibrating warning. He was ready for a fight, but she was offering him none. Then she began to read. Her voice was not a whisper, but it was soft, steady, and even. She read a simple story about a bear searching for honey, her tone creating a gentle rhythm that was the complete opposite of the shelter's jarring chaos. The little bear followed the buzzing sound, she read, through a field of tall, yellow flowers. The words hung in the air between them, a small island of calm in the middle of a noisy sea. After a few sentences, the growling stopped. Barney tilted his big, shaggy head, his ears twitching. This was new. No one had ever just sat and spoken to the air in front of his cage. He remained tense, but the immediate aggression faded, replaced by a confused curiosity. He was listening, trying to understand this strange new sound that asked nothing of him and did not hurt his ears. It was the first time someone had brought peace into his space, instead of fear. Slowly, cautiously, Barney lowered himself to the ground. He lay with his head on his paws, his body still facing her, never taking his wary eyes off her. But he was no longer a coiled spring of panic. He was an animal at rest, listening. Clara continued to read, page after page, her voice never wavering. A strange, profound silence settled around them, a quiet so deep that it felt more significant than all the noise in the building combined. When she finished the chapter, she gently closed the book. The soft thud of the cover seemed to echo in the quiet space they had created. She stood up slowly, brushed off her pants, and looked at Barney one last time. He was still lying down, watching her. For the first time, he didn't bark or lunge as she walked away. He simply watched her go, a silent, watchful gaze following her down the hall. Clara left the shelter feeling a fragile spark of hope. One quiet hour was a start, a single peaceful moment in a life full of terror. But as she walked toward her car, she glanced at the setting sun, and the manager's words echoed in her mind. A clock was ticking for the dog in cage 7, and she knew that time was a luxury he did not have. The next day, and the day after that, their quiet meeting became a ritual. Clara would arrive in the mid-afternoon when the shelter was at its loudest, and her presence would carve out a small pocket of peace. Barney no longer greeted her with barks or growls. Instead, he would be waiting, sitting patiently at the back of his cage. The moment he saw her, he would get up, walk to the front, and lie down, his head on his paws, his eyes fixed on the book in her hands. His anticipation was a silent, powerful thing. This strange, quiet friendship did not go unnoticed. The shelter workers, who once hurried past cage 7 with a sense of dread, now slowed down. They would watch from a distance, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and wonder. They whispered to each other, marveling at how the dog they had labeled a lost cause would transform for this one quiet woman. His world of frantic noise had one calm, predictable anchor, and that anchor was the sound of her voice reading a story. One afternoon, the routine was shattered. A heavy metal cart, overloaded with bags of dog food, snagged on a crack in the concrete floor. It tipped over with a deafening crash, the metal frame shrieking as it scraped the ground. The sudden violence of the sound made Clara flinch hard, a sharp intake of breath catching in her throat as her own past traumas echoed in the noise. It was a feeling she knew all too well, the feeling of the world suddenly becoming unsafe. In his cage, Barney didn't bark. He recoiled with a full-body cringe, as if struck by an invisible blow. For a brief, terrible moment, all their progress seemed to vanish. Then, his wide, terrified eyes found hers across the few feet of concrete that separated them. In that shared glance, there was no human and animal, only two souls who understood the same language of fear. It was a silent, gut-wrenching moment of complete and total empathy. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe. She placed a hand on her own chest, a small gesture to steady herself, and then she picked up her book again. Her voice trembled on the first few words, betraying her own fear, but she pushed on, determined to be the calm he needed. She kept her tone low and even, speaking the simple words of the story, as if they were a shield against the lingering echo of the crash. Seeing her distress, Barney did something extraordinary. He crawled forward on his belly inch by inch until his nose was pressed right against the chain link of his cage door. It was the closest he had ever willingly come to a person. He made a soft, low sound in his throat, a sound that was not a growl, but a quiet acknowledgement of her fear. He was offering her the only comfort he could. As she looked at him, so close and so vulnerable, Clara had a profound realization. She hadn't just been coming here to soothe him. In forcing herself to be his source of calm, she was learning to manage her own fears. In the process of healing his wounds, she was tending to her own. The line between the rescuer and the rescued had blurred completely, leaving only two companions sitting together in the quiet aftermath. And she wondered if this unspoken bond could ever be strong enough to convince a world that relied on written rules and loud commands. Just as the visiting hours were ending, the shelter manager approached her, his face etched with a familiar weariness. He didn't meet her eyes at first, instead looking toward Barney, who was now dozing peacefully. "Clara," he began, his voice low and full of regret. "I'm sorry." The board reviewed his case. "We have 3 days. By Friday afternoon, we have to, you know." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The word protocol hung in the air, cold and sharp as steel. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. The quiet peace she had so carefully built shattered into a million pieces. She looked at Barney, sleeping so trustfully, completely unaware that his time was running out. The sheer injustice of it all was a physical pain in her chest. All their progress, all their silent understanding. It meant nothing to a committee, to a rule book. His fate was sealed by a label he had been given before she ever met him. She didn't leave when the manager did. She couldn't. She sat there on the floor and read until her voice grew hoarse, long after the last employee had left for the day and the shelter lights had dimmed to a faint glow. She read as if her words could build a fortress around him, a shield that could somehow hold back the relentless march of time. It was a desperate, hopeless vigil, a final offering of peace before the world came to take it all away. Later that night, Back in her own apartment, the silence that had always been her comfort now felt hollow and suffocating. She was surrounded by thousands of books, thousands of stories, but not one of them could offer her the solace she needed. Her perfectly ordered life, a fortress she had built to keep the chaotic world at bay, now felt like a lonely, empty prison. The peace she had here was nothing compared to the fragile, meaningful quiet she shared with Barney. Her gaze fell on the adoption application she had picked up from the front desk a week earlier, telling herself it was just in case. It lay on her coffee table, a single sheet of paper that represented a terrifying leap into the unknown. Adopting him would mean inviting chaos, noise, and unpredictability into her carefully controlled world. It meant confronting her own fears every single day. It meant changing everything. She looked around her quiet, orderly apartment, a space designed for one. Then she closed her eyes and saw Barney's face, his patient, trusting eyes looking at her through the chain-link fence. The decision was no longer a decision. It was a necessity. With a sudden, unshakable resolve, she walked to the table, picked up a pen, and in a firm, clear hand began to fill out the form. Her name, her address, his name, Barney. She placed the completed form on her nightstand, a promise waiting for the morning. As she lay in bed, she didn't think about the challenges ahead. Instead, she thought about the sound of his soft breathing as he slept. And for the first time, the thought of another life sharing her silence didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a blessing. But the shelter didn't open until 9, and Friday afternoon was drawing closer with every tick of the clock. Would her promise be enough, and would she be in time? Clara drove to the shelter the next morning with the signed adoption form on the passenger seat. Her hands were tight on the steering wheel, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. It was a strange mix of terror and exhilarating hope. This single piece of paper was more than just a document. It was a promise, a turning point. She was about to intentionally break the quiet, orderly walls she had spent years building, all for a dog who had never heard a kind word until she came along. She walked quickly down the familiar concrete corridor, the usual chorus of barks barely registering. Her eyes were fixed on the far end of the hall, on cage 7, but as she drew closer, her steps slowed and a cold dread washed over her. The cage door was open. The small space was empty. The concrete floor swept clean. For a heart-stopping second, she froze, her breath caught in her throat. She was too late. The thought was a physical blow, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Just as despair began to set in, the manager appeared from his office. He saw the look on her face and offered a small, tired smile. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded his head toward the open office door behind him, a silent invitation. Clara's heart leaped back into her chest, and she moved forward, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. There, in the middle of the small, cluttered office, sat Barney. He wasn't in a cage or on a leash. He was just sitting on the worn linoleum floor, perfectly calm. When he saw her, he didn't jump or bark. He simply lifted his head, his soft brown eyes meeting hers with a look of such profound, knowing stillness it almost took her breath away. It was as if he had been waiting, as if he knew all along that she would come for him. With trembling hands, Clara knelt down and clipped a brand new blue leash onto his collar. The soft click was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Together, they walked out of the office and down the long corridor for the last time. When they stepped out of the main doors, the bright morning sunlight felt like a welcome. It was the first time Barney had felt the sun on his back as a free dog, not just through the bars of a cage. Back at her small, quiet apartment, Barney was cautious. He walked slowly through each room, his nose twitching as he took in the new smells of old books, fresh laundry, and Clara herself. He explored every corner with a gentle curiosity, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the hardwood floor. After his tour was complete, he walked over to where Clara was standing in the living room, circled once, and settled on the rug right beside her feet with a soft sigh. Clara sank down to the floor beside him, leaning her back against the sofa. She didn't read. She didn't speak. They just sat there together, sharing the comfortable silence. It was a new kind of quiet for her apartment. It wasn't the empty, sterile silence of being alone. It was a silence that was full, a living, breathing quiet that was shared. She had brought him home, but as she looked at him, she had a feeling that their journey was far from over. This was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a completely new one. A few weeks later, an official-looking letter arrived at the library for Clara. It was from the County Historical Society. They had recently acquired the old Willow Creek Manor, a sprawling estate on the edge of the woods, and they needed an expert archivist to sort through and catalog the vast, untouched library within. The project was expected to take the entire summer. It was a professional honor, a task she would have once accepted without a second thought. Now she did have a second thought. Barney. She looked at him, dozing on his rug, and smiled. A summer away from the city's sudden noises, in a quiet house surrounded by nature, would be the perfect next step for him. It was a chance for them both to breathe. She accepted the offer the same day, picturing long, peaceful walks through sun-dappled woods and quiet evenings spent with her work while Barney slept by a fireplace. When they arrived, the manor was even more grand and isolated than she had imagined. A beautiful stone house half swallowed by ivy. A long gravel driveway crunched under her car's tires. They were greeted by an elderly caretaker named Mr. Gable, a man with kind eyes and a face as weathered as the manor's stone walls. As he showed them to their rooms, he gestured to a portrait in the hall. "That's Lady Alara," he said with a little smile, "the first owner. The locals say her ghost still wanders the halls looking for a lost brooch." Later, as they sat on the porch with glasses of lemonade, Mr. Oz, Gable leaned in conspiratorially. "The construction crew preparing the place for tours, they're spooked," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They say that, late at night, you can hear a woman weeping somewhere in the West Wing, a sad, lonely sound. It was the kind of story that made a place feel alive with history and legend." Clara, a woman who believed in catalog numbers and verifiable facts, offered a polite smile. "Old houses make old noises, Mr. Gable," she said gently. "It's probably just the wind in the eaves or the water in the old pipes." In her mind, every mystery had a logical explanation, and a ghost was the least likely of them all. She was here for the books, not for ghost stories. Barney, however, did not seem so sure. While Clara remained calm, he was on edge from the moment they arrived. He didn't bark or growl, but he stood with a low, alert posture, his nose constantly testing the air. He seemed to sense something she couldn't, a scent, a sound, a change in the atmosphere that was imperceptible to her. He was settled now at her feet, but his ears twitched at every creak and groan of the old house. That night, as Clara lay in bed reading, a storm rolled in, and the wind began to howl around the corners of the manor. Barney, who usually slept soundly, was restless. And then, during a lull in the wind, she heard it. It was faint, high-pitched, and mournful, almost like a distant cry. She told herself it was just a draft, whistling through a keyhole, a trick of the wind and an old house. but a small, unwelcome shiver ran down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was trying to tell her something. The next morning, Clara began her work. The manor's library was a stunning two-story room, filled with the dusty, comforting scent of old paper and leather. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. Barney, who had been unusually quiet and subdued all morning, lay on a large rug in the center of the room, his head on his paws, watching her with an unnerving intensity. He seemed to have forgotten the simple joy of a nap and a patch of sun. Suddenly, in the middle of the quiet morning, he stood up. His movement was abrupt, purposeful. He walked over to Clara, who was carefully examining a fragile, leather-bound book, and gently but firmly nudged her hand with his wet nose. Then he turned and looked toward the library door, his tail giving a single, expectant thump against a bookshelf. It was clear he wanted her to follow him. Puzzled but trusting his lead, Clara put the book down and followed him out of the library. He led her not towards the main hall or the gardens, but down a long, echoing corridor she hadn't yet explored. The air grew cooler here, and the portraits on the walls seemed to watch them with faded, somber eyes. This was the West Wing, Mr. Rigg, Gable had mentioned, a part of the house that felt deserted and forgotten, heavy with an unspoken sadness. Barney stopped dead in front of a section of wall covered in faded floral wallpaper. The pattern of intertwined willow branches was seamless, with no hint of a door or an opening. It was just a wall, like any other in the long hallway. But Barney was transfixed. He stood perfectly still, his body rigid, his nose pointed directly at the center of the wall. He was completely focused, as if he were staring at something only he could see. Then, he let out a sound Clara had never heard him make before. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a low, mournful whine that seemed to come from deep within his chest, a sound of profound sadness and confusion. He was clearly distressed, his quiet whimper echoing in the silent hallway. He was trying to tell her something, pointing to this specific spot with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. She ran her hands over the wallpaper, feeling for any crack, any hidden latch or seam, but found nothing. The wall was solid and smooth. She gently tried to coax him away, patting his side and speaking in a low, soothing voice. "It's okay, boy. There's nothing there." But Barney refused to move. He planted his feet, leaning his weight against the wall, and nudged the baseboard with his nose, his quiet insistence turning into a silent plea. Trusting the animal she had come to know so well, Clara pulled a small notepad and a pencil from her pocket. She made a quick sketch of the hallway, marking the exact spot where Barney stood with a large X. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it wasn't random. Barney, the dog who was terrified of loud noises, had an incredibly sensitive perception of the world, and right now, every instinct he possessed was telling her that this ordinary wall was the most important place in the entire house. The next day, haunted by Barney's strange behavior, Clara shifted her focus from the main library collection to the manor's private archives. She was searching for anything that could explain what lay behind that wall. Tucked away in a small, windowless room, she found a series of dusty, leather-bound volumes, the personal diaries of Lady Alara, the White Lady of the Ghost Stories. She took one back to the library, with Barney watching her every move. She opened the first diary, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting inside was elegant and flowing, but as she read, she could feel a deep undercurrent of emotion in the looping script. These were not the writings of a distant historical figure. They were the intimate, heartfelt words of a young woman deeply in love with her life, her husband, and, most of all, her family. The early entries were filled with joy. She read about the planting of the gardens, the choice of wallpaper for the West Wing, and the happy news of her pregnancy. Lady Alara's love for her infant son Arthur radiated from every page. She described his first smile, the soft feel of his hair, the way his tiny hand would curl around her finger. The diary was a testament to a mother's boundless affection. Then, the tone of the entries shifted abruptly. A few short, panicked sentences described a sudden fever. The pages that followed were filled with a grief so raw and palpable that Clara had to stop reading for a moment to catch her breath. Little Arthur had died, and with him, all the light and joy had gone out of Lady Alara's world. The elegant script became jagged and strained, often blurred by what could only have been tears. As she read on, Clara found the entry she had been looking for. "My husband gave me a brooch of moonstone when our Arthur was born," Alara wrote. "He said it held the light of the stars. It is my only treasure now, the last thing that reminds me of the light he brought into my life." This was the lost brooch from the legend, not just a piece of jewelry, but a sacred link to her lost child. The final entries were filled with a quiet, heartbreaking despair. Alara wrote of feeling lost in the cavernous house, of wandering the halls where her son had once been. Her last entry was cryptic and filled with sorrow. "I must keep his memory safe," she wrote. "I will keep it beside him, where it belongs. I will hide my heart away forever." Clara gently closed the diary, her own heart aching for the woman who had lived here over a century ago. The ghost story was wrong. This wasn't a tale of a restless spirit searching for lost treasure. This was the story of a grieving mother trying to preserve the memory of her son. The mystery of the manor was not about a ghost, it was about a profound and enduring love. And she had a growing suspicion that Barney, in his own silent way, had somehow led her right to the heart of it. That evening, determined to find a logical explanation, Clara stayed in the library long after the sun had set. The wind picked up again, and soon the same mournful weeping sound she'd heard before began to drift through the manor. This time, however, she was ready. With a flashlight in hand, she set out to trace the sound to its source, leaving Barney sleeping soundly on his rug, exhausted from his emotional day. Her search led her up a narrow, winding staircase to the dusty, cobweb-filled attic. The sound was louder here, a high-pitched, eerie wail. It wasn't coming from any of the rooms, but from the very structure of the house itself. Following the sound, she found an old brick chimney stack that ran up through the center of the attic. There, near the roofline, was a small, almost invisible crack in the mortar. The wind, forced through this tiny opening, was creating the perfect haunting illusion of a woman's cry. Feeling a sense of relief, she returned to the library. One mystery was solved, but the more important one remained. The ghost's cry was just the wind, but Barney's fixation on that wall was real. He hadn't reacted to the sound, only to that specific place. Her mind now clear of supernatural theories, she turned her attention to finding a practical answer. If the wall was important, the house itself must hold the clue. She went back to the archives, this time searching not for diaries, but for something far more mundane, the original architectural blueprints of the manor. After nearly an hour of searching through dusty tubes of rolled-up parchment, she found them. She carefully unrolled the massive, fragile document on a large table, its faded blue lines depicting the house as it was first built, over 150 years ago. Her eyes scanned the detailed layout of the West Wing. She traced the long corridor with her finger, past the study and the sitting rooms, until she reached the section that corresponded with the wallpapered wall. And there it was. The faded ink clearly labeled a small room, tucked away between two larger guest suites. A room that no longer existed on the manor's current floor plan. The label was written in elegant, cursive script. It was a single, heart-stopping phrase, Arthur's nursery. It was his room. The room that Lady Alara had so lovingly decorated. The room where she had spent the happiest, and then the most tragic, moments of her life. The room that, at some point in the manor's long history, had been sealed off, hidden from the world, behind a wall of plaster and floral wallpaper. Clara stood back from the table, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a quiet, satisfying click. The diary, the legend, the wall, the blueprints. They all pointed to the same conclusion. The story wasn't about a ghost haunting a hallway. It was about a mother's love so powerful that she had turned her son's room into a time capsule, a hidden sanctuary of memory. And somehow, Barney had known. The next morning, armed with her evidence, Clara found Mr. Gable in the garden, patiently tending to his roses. He listened with a raised eyebrow as she laid out her theory, his initial skepticism clear on his weathered face. A hidden room? Miss Clara, I've worked here for 30 years. I think I'd know if there was an extra room, he said, though his tone was more curious than dismissive. Clara didn't argue. Instead, she unrolled the blueprints on a nearby garden bench, pointing to the faded lines that clearly showed the nursery. Then, she opened Lady Alara's diary to the final heartbreaking entry. She wasn't a ghost looking for a brooch, Mr. Gable, Clara explained softly. She was a mother protecting a memory. The story has been misunderstood all these years. Mr. Stood. Gable read the passage, his expression softening as he took in the century-old words of grief. That is a sad story, he admitted, looking from the diary to the distant windows of the West Wing. But breaking down a wall, the Historical Society will have my hide. It's a big ask, all based on a feeling from a dog. Clara knew she needed one final convincing argument. It's not just a feeling, she said, her voice firm with conviction. Barney is different. Loud noises terrify him. His senses are more acute than ours. He isn't hearing a ghost. He's sensing something else. Maybe it's a change in air pressure, a scent trapped behind the wall for 100 years. I don't know what it is, but I know him, and I trust him completely. Just then, Barney, who had been sitting quietly at Clara's feet, got up and walked over to the old caretaker. He didn't jump or bark. He simply rested his heavy head on Mr. Stan, Gable's knee, and looked up at him with his soulful, intelligent eyes. It was a simple, silent gesture of trust, a quiet appeal from one gentle soul to another. That was the moment that broke through the old man's skepticism. He looked down at Barney, then back at Clara's earnest face, and a slow smile spread across his lips. The quiet dignity of the dog had accomplished what her logic and evidence alone could not. All right, Mr. Gable sighed, a twinkle in his eye. You win. Let's not tell the society just yet. I've got a couple of grandsons who are good with a crowbar. Let's go see if your dog is a historian. Clara felt a wave of triumphant relief. They were about to break the rules, to follow an instinct that defied all logical explanation. It was a risk, but as she looked at Barney, who now stood proudly beside her, she knew it was the right thing to do. They were on the verge of uncovering a secret that had been hidden for generations, not for the sake of treasure, but to bring peace to a long-forgotten story of love and loss. An hour later, Mr. Uncovering, Gable returned with his two grandsons, sturdy young men carrying a pry bar and a sledgehammer. They looked skeptical but willing, their curiosity piqued by their grandfather's unusual request. He led them to the West Wing, to the spot on the wall that Clara had marked. Barney stood beside her, his body vibrating with a quiet, focused energy. He seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. The work began carefully. One of the grandsons tapped the wall with the back of a hammer, listening for a hollow sound. Right where Barney had indicated, the dull thud of plaster gave way to a deeper, more resonant echo. "Granddad, she's right," the young man said, a look of surprise on his face. "There's empty space back here." With a nod from Mr. Gable, he used the pry bar to carefully remove a section of the wooden baseboard. Behind the baseboard, they found the faint outline of a door frame, long since plastered over. With renewed purpose, they began to work, carefully chipping away at the old plaster and lath. Clouds of white dust filled the hallway, smelling of chalk and time. It was slow, painstaking work, as they were careful not to damage whatever lay behind. Clara stood back, her hand resting on Barney's fur, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and reverence. Finally, with a loud crack, a large section of the wall came loose, revealing a dark, square opening. The air that drifted out was stale and musty, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was the scent of a room that had been sealed away, a capsule of time waiting to be opened. A moment of hushed silence fell over the small group as they all peered into the darkness, the grandsons holding their flashlights up to illuminate the space within. Barney didn't hesitate. Before anyone could move, he stepped gracefully through the opening. His tail, which had been tense, now gave a slow, gentle wag. He wasn't scared or agitated. He seemed calm, as if he had finally reached the place he had been searching for. He walked confidently into the center of the hidden room, his paws making soft prints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. The room was just as the blueprints had suggested, a child's nursery, perfectly preserved. A small, ornate crib stood against one wall, an embroidered blanket still neatly folded inside. A beautifully carved rocking horse stood frozen mid-gallop, its painted eyes staring into the darkness. On a small shelf, a collection of tiny, leather-bound storybooks sat in a neat row, untouched for over a century. It was a place of profound stillness, a silent monument to a life cut short. Barney walked past the crib and the rocking horse, his nose to the ground. He led them to the far corner of the room, away from the more obvious furniture. He stopped over a specific spot on the floor, nudged one of the dark wooden floorboards with his nose, and then looked back at Clara. His job was done. He had led them here, to this exact spot, with a certainty that defied all explanation. Mr. Gable knelt down, his old knees cracking in protest, and examined the floorboard Barney had indicated. It looked no different from the others, but when he pressed on it, it shifted with a faint groan. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, pulling a small pocket knife from his trousers. He carefully worked the blade into the seam and pried the board up. It came away easily, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath the floor. Reaching into the space, his fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of wood. He carefully lifted out a small, rectangular box, intricately carved with images of willow leaves and songbirds. It was not a treasure chest, but a delicate keepsake box. He gently blew a century's worth of dust from its lid and handed it to Clara, his eyes full of a newfound respect for her and her remarkable dog. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she took the box. It was surprisingly light. The latch, a small brass clasp in the shape of a feather, was not locked. With a soft click, she opened the lid. The small group gathered around her, their flashlights creating a circle of light around the small, revealed secret. A collective, gentle gasp filled the dusty air. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay a stunning silver brooch. A single, luminous moonstone was set in its center, and it seemed to glow with a soft, milky light of its own, even in the dimness of the hidden room. It was exactly as Lady Alara had described it in her diary, a piece of captured starlight. It was beautiful, but it was not the only thing in the box. Beside the brooch lay something far more precious. It was a tiny, perfect lock of pale blonde hair, tied with a delicate blue silk ribbon. The color was still vibrant, a bright, shining testament to the little boy who had once filled this room with life. It was a piece of him, kept safe and hidden from the ravages of time. It was a mother's most sacred treasure. Tucked beneath the ribbon was a small, folded piece of paper. Clara carefully picked it up, her fingers gentle on the fragile parchment. She unfolded it and read the words aloud, her voice soft in the reverent silence of the room. The note, written in the same elegant, looping script from the diary, contained a simple, heartbreaking message. My Arthur, my heart's treasure, forever safe beside me. Clara looked from the note to the lock of hair, and then to Barney, who sat patiently, his head tilted as if listening. The mystery was finally solved. Lady Alara hadn't lost her brooch. She hadn't been a restless spirit searching for a lost object. She had been a mother who, in her deepest grief, had created a secret shrine. She had hidden her most precious memories in the one place no one would ever disturb them, in the heart of her son's room, forever safe, forever loved. News of the discovery traveled fast. Mr. Kexpure, Gable, with a storyteller's flair, called the Historical Society, and soon the quiet manor was bustling with carefully controlled excitement. Historians and preservation experts arrived, their voices hushed with awe as they examined the perfectly preserved nursery. The story of the Willow Creek Ghost was officially retired, replaced by the true, poignant tale of Lady Alara and her son, Arthur. The manor was no longer seen as haunted, but as a place of profound historical and emotional significance. That evening, the atmosphere in the old house was completely transformed. The heavy, sorrowful silence that had seemed to hang in the air was gone, replaced by a feeling of gentle peace. The setting sun cast long, warm shadows through the windows, and the entire manor felt as if it had finally exhaled a breath it had been holding for over a century. The weeping sound of the wind in the chimney was just that. The wind and the shadows in the hallways were just shadows. The house felt settled, its secrets finally brought into the light. Clara, Mr. Rule, Gable, and Barney sat together on the wide stone veranda, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the tree line. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say that the quiet, shared satisfaction didn't already express. This was their victory, a quiet triumph of empathy and trust over legend and fear. They had not banished a ghost, they had honored a memory. Mr. Gable, a man who had lived his whole life alongside the ghost story, reached down and scratched Barney behind the ears. "You know," he said, his voice full of quiet wonder, "I've walked past that wall 10,000 times, never felt a thing." He looked at the dog with a mixture of affection and disbelief. "You're a special one, Barney. You heard something none of us could. Not with your ears, but with whatever it is you've got." He then pulled a small piece of cheese from his pocket, a forbidden treat he'd saved from dinner, and slipped it to the dog, giving Clara a conspiratorial wink. Clara spent one last night in the guest room. She lay awake for a long time, not from unease, but from a sense of deep contentment. The manor was completely, profoundly silent. It was a silence she had never experienced before, not empty or lonely, but peaceful and whole. It was the silence of a story that had finally found its ending. The next morning, as she packed her car, the first rays of sunlight touched the ivy-covered stone walls, making them glow with a warm, golden light. It felt like a new beginning for the house and for them. She looked at the manor one last time, no longer seeing a place of sorrow, but a testament to a mother's undying love. They had come here to catalog books, but they had ended up cataloging a heart, bringing its long-hidden story back to the world. As they said their goodbyes, Mr. Cumpier, Gable shook Clara's hand firmly, his grip warm and sincere. "You two brought a kindness to this old place that it's been missing for a long time," he said. He then knelt down to look Barney in the eye. "And you, my friend," he whispered, giving the dog a final, fond pat. "You're a better historian than any of us." Barney responded with a soft lick on the old man's weathered hand. The drive back to the city was quiet and reflective. Clara would occasionally glance in the rearview mirror at Barney, who was curled up on the back seat, sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of a dog who knows he is safe. His work was done. She thought about the journey they had taken together, a path that had led them from the frantic noise of a shelter cage to the sacred silence of a hidden room. She thought about how much she had changed. The woman who had flinched at every loud noise, who had built a life around the avoidance of chaos, had just spent a summer willingly embracing a century-old mystery. She had trusted not in facts and figures, but in the unexplainable instinct of her dog. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, a courage that came not from being fearless, but from acting in spite of her fear. As they entered the city limits, the familiar sounds of traffic, sirens, and life no longer felt like an assault. The noise was still there, but it didn't penetrate her calm in the same way. Her quiet center, once so fragile, now felt solid and unshakable, fortified by the silent, steady presence of the dog in her back seat. He had taught her that the loudest things in the world are not always the most important. She unlocked the door to her apartment, and they were greeted by the comforting, familiar scent of books and home. It was the same space she had left weeks ago, but it felt different. It was no longer a fortress designed to keep the world out. It was a haven, a starting point for adventures, a warm and welcoming place to return to. It was a home for both of them. Barney, without any hesitation, walked straight to his favorite rug by the armchair, circled 3 times, and flopped down with a contented groan. He was home. His journey from a place of terror to a place of absolute belonging was complete. He lifted his head and watched her as she put her keys on the hook and began to unpack. His soft gaze a constant, reassuring presence. Clara looked at him, her heart swelling with a love so deep it was almost overwhelming. They had rescued each other from their respective cages, his made of steel and concrete, hers made of fear and silence. But their adventure at the manor had proven something more. Together, they hadn't just saved each other. They had learned to bring their unique brand of quiet healing out into the world, capable of mending stories that had been broken for a very long time. A few days later, life had settled back into its comfortable, peaceful rhythm. The evening light slanted through the window of Clara's apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny spark in the golden glow. The adventure at the manor already felt like a lovely, half-remembered dream. Clara sat in her favorite armchair, a thick book resting open in her lap, but she wasn't reading. Her attention was elsewhere. Barney was asleep at her feet, his big, shaggy body completely relaxed. His head was resting on her worn leather slipper, a gesture of casual, trusting ownership. Every few moments, a soft, contented sigh would escape him, a sound of absolute peace. His rhythmic, gentle breathing was the only sound in the room, a quiet percussion that was more comforting to Clara than any music. It was the sound of safety, of belonging. She put her book aside, not wanting anything to distract from the perfect stillness of the moment. She looked around her small apartment, at the neat rows of books on the shelves, at the single teacup on the table beside her, and at the sleeping dog who had so completely and wonderfully altered her quiet world. She had once curated her silence like a precious, fragile artifact. Now it was a shared and living thing. She realized, with a sense of profound clarity, that she no longer feared the silence, nor did she fear the noise of the world outside. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with Barney's presence, with the unspoken bond they shared. And the noise was no longer a threat, because she had a quiet, unshakable center to return to. He had been her anchor in the chaotic sea of the shelter, and now he was the anchor of her entire life. Leaning forward, she gently ran her hand down the length of his back, her fingers sinking into his thick, soft fur. His tail gave a sleepy, almost imperceptible thump-thump against the rug, a response that came even in his dreams. Words were not, and had never been, necessary between them. They communicated in a language of shared glances, gentle nudges, and the simple, profound comfort of presence. She looked from the dog at her feet to the rows of stories on her shelves. They had lived through a story of their own, one as magical as any fairy tale and as true as any history. They had healed each other's pasts and, in doing so, had brought peace to a story that had been waiting a century to be heard. It was a quiet miracle, one that had unfolded not with a crash of thunder, but with the gentle turning of a page. A soft smile touched Clara's lips. Their quiet world wasn't a weakness or a retreat from life. It was their greatest strength. It was a strength that could calm the fearful, solve the mysterious, and hear the whispers of the past. As she sat there, watching her dog dream, she felt a quiet prayer of gratitude rise in her heart. She had gone to the shelter to offer a little bit of peace, and in return, she had been given the whole world. This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening. If you liked the story, please consider liking and subscribing to my humble channel. And if you propose an idea for the next story that you want to hear in comments, I just may do it. Goodbye. Oh.